The quiet town of Elmswood was the kind of place where nothing ever really happened. People kept their lawns trimmed, waved at their neighbors, and locked their doors at night, more out of habit than fear. That peace was shattered one rainy evening, when emergency services received a call from a man named Harold Simmons. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as he reported that his wife, Margaret Simmons, had fallen down the stairs and wasn't breathing. Police arrived quickly. The house was large, old, and filled with antiques. Margaret's body was found at the bottom of the staircase, her head resting against a wooden step, blood pooling around her hair. Harold stood nearby, barely shaken. He explained that he had been upstairs reading when he heard the sound of something heavy tumbling down. He found Margaret like this, unresponsive. Margaret Simmons was 68 years old. She had been well known in Elmswood for her charity work and had once run a small bookstore in the town center. She was loved by many, known for her kindness and generosity. Her death shocked everyone. At first glance, it seemed like a tragic accident. The steps were wooden and steep. There was no railing on one side. Margaret's shoes were found nearby. It was raining. It all made sense. But something about the scene bothered Detective Lisa Monroe. She was experienced in accidents like these didn't sit right when the victim had bruises that looked older than the fall itself. The medical examiner confirmed her suspicions. Margaret had indeed suffered head trauma consistent with a fall, but there was also a deep bruise around her neck. It was faint but visible. A second opinion confirmed what Monroe feared. Someone had strangled Margaret before she fell. A case was opened. Harold was interviewed again. His story didn't change, but his behavior seemed too rehearsed. He showed no real emotion. He didn't ask questions about the investigation. Instead, he seemed more concerned about the funeral arrangements and the house. Within a week, another detail emerged. Margaret's life insurance policy had been updated just 3 months prior. The total payout? $1.9 million. The beneficiary? Harold Simmons. This changed everything. Police began digging deeper into Harold's past. He was 72, retired, and had once worked in real estate. But documents showed that he had been facing financial troubles for years. Several failed investments, 2 lawsuits, a maxed-out mortgage on the house. He was nearly broke. The new will Margaret had signed listed Harold as the sole inheritor of her estate. But the signature raised questions. It looked off. Too smooth. Too perfect. Investigators sent it to a handwriting expert who confirmed their suspicion. The signature was likely forged. The pieces started to fall into place. Harold needed money. Margaret had it. And now she was gone. But the evidence wasn't strong enough yet. There were no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no security footage. The staircase had no blood trail beyond the impact point. Harold maintained his innocence. Then something unexpected happened. A neighbor, Mrs. Green, came forward. She remembered seeing Harold carry something heavy to the shed behind their house the night before Margaret died. The shed was old and rarely used. Police searched it. Inside, they found a plastic bag hidden under some gardening tools. Inside the bag were latex gloves, a roll of duct tape, and a broken necklace that Margaret was known to wear every day. The necklace had blood on the clasp. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it gave Monroe more reason to keep pushing. She requested Margaret's phone records, searching for anything unusual. One call stood out, a voicemail from Margaret to her lawyer, left just 4 days before she died. She mentioned wanting to update her will again, this time to include her niece instead of Harold. That update never happened. Detective Monroe now believed Harold had discovered his wife's plans to change the will. If she had succeeded, he would have received nothing. So he acted quickly. Despite all this, Harold remained free. He had hired a lawyer and refused to answer further questions. He stayed inside most days, only coming out to collect his mail. But the town had turned cold. Former friends now looked at him with suspicion. The weight of silence grew. Then came the biggest break in the case. A local repairman named Todd Jackson contacted the police. He had been called to fix the Simmons' upstairs bathroom about 2 months earlier. During that visit, he recalled overhearing Harold on the phone, speaking angrily about debts, using words like ruined and last chance. At the time, Todd thought nothing of it. But now it seemed important. That statement gave police just enough to get a search warrant for Harold's laptop. What they found stunned them. Search history showed dozens of visits to forums and websites about how to fake accidents, how to cause a fall, how long it took for bruises to fade. Even discussions about the best way to stage a death for an insurance claim. With digital evidence in hand, Monroe made her move. Police returned to Harold's home on a quiet Tuesday morning. This time, they weren't there to talk. They arrested him for the murder of his wife. Harold didn't resist. He simply stared at the officers as they led him away. The people of Elmswood watched in silence as their once peaceful town was forever changed. Let me know when you're ready for Chapter 2. News of Harold Simmons' arrest spread across Elmswood like wildfire. The idea that a man who had shared his life with Margaret for over 40 years could be responsible for her death was almost too much for the town to believe. But the evidence against him, though not yet presented in court, painted a chilling picture. Harold had lived in that big old house for decades, attended every church service, and hosted summer barbecues. He was the man who helped neighbors shovel snow, who brought cookies to town meetings. And now he was being held in a county jail, accused of killing his wife for money. The prosecution wasted no time. Detective Lisa Monroe continued building her case. For her, it wasn't about how Harold looked or how long he had been married. It was about what the facts revealed, and those facts were piling up fast. Harold's financial situation had been worsening for years. His accounts showed large withdrawals, failed investments, and overdrawn credit cards. His real estate license had expired 2 years earlier, and he hadn't made a legitimate income in months. By contrast, Margaret was careful with money. Her inheritance from her parents, her pension, and the profits from the bookstore she had sold 5 years prior had all been managed wisely. She had nearly $2 million in assets, and the recent life insurance policy was the final piece. Investigators uncovered that Margaret hadn't originally planned to leave everything to Harold. In fact, her original will split her estate between her niece in Florida and a local animal shelter. It was only after Harold convinced her that they needed to simplify things for tax purposes that she made the change. But the updated signature raised concerns. The handwriting analyst had said it showed signs of being traced, and further testing suggested it had likely been copied from a previous document. That alone wasn't enough to prove murder, but it fit into the larger puzzle. Detective Monroe also examined the household security system. While the cameras inside the home had been removed years ago when Harold complained they made him feel watched, there was still a system log. The log showed that the system had been disarmed manually just minutes before Margaret was found at the bottom of the stairs. If it were an accident, why would anyone disable the system right before? Harold had claimed he was reading upstairs, yet his fingerprints were on the control panel. Even more disturbing, the log showed the disarm code had been entered twice, once late the night before and once again in the early morning, an hour before the 911 call. Meanwhile, Harold's defense attorney argued that the case was all circumstantial. He claimed Harold had been devoted to Margaret, that he had nothing to gain by killing her since he was her husband and already lived comfortably. The bruises on her neck, he said, could have happened during the fall. The broken necklace could have been an accident. The gloves and duct tape? Old junk from the shed. There was no footage, no eyewitness, no confession. But what they didn't expect was a small USB drive found by accident. While packing up Margaret's personal things from her office, a technician found the drive behind a cabinet. On it were scanned copies of emails, notes, and a video diary Margaret had started months before she died. In one entry, she talked about feeling isolated. She mentioned Harold growing more irritable and secretive. She feared he was hiding something, but didn't want to confront him directly. One line in particular caught Monroe's attention. "If anything ever happens to me, I want people to know I was planning to change my will again." The drive was a game changer. Though Margaret never directly accused Harold, the video entries showed that she had growing concerns. In her notes, she had written questions about her finances, strange behavior Harold was displaying, and even the name of the lawyer she planned to contact to revise her documents. It proved she had motive. To remove Harold from the will, a motive he might have learned about. Further forensic work revealed that the gloves in the shed had traces of Margaret's blood, even though Harold claimed he hadn't touched her body after finding it. The duct tape had a single strand of Margaret's hair and adhesive residue, matching a faint mark on her jawline. Experts confirmed that pressure had been applied to her neck before the fall, enough to restrict her breathing. It suggested she had been attacked, then pushed or arranged to appear as if she'd fallen. The final piece came from Harold's phone records. In the weeks leading up to Margaret's death, he had made several calls to a private investigator. The investigator later admitted that Harold had hired him to follow Margaret, suspecting that she was meeting secretly with a financial advisor. Harold, according to the man, was paranoid that Margaret was hiding money or planning to cut him out. When asked why he didn't mention this earlier, the investigator explained he didn't think it was relevant until he learned about the murder charges. All of this began to paint a clear motive. Harold was desperate. He saw Margaret's money as his way out of debt and back to the life he believed he deserved. But when he learned she might be changing the will again, he panicked. Instead of trying to save the marriage, he took a darker path. He disabled the alarm, waited for the right moment, and then made it look like an accident. He almost got away with it. Back in jail, Harold maintained his innocence. He refused interviews, denied any wrongdoing, and claimed he was being framed. But as the evidence mounted, even some of his friends stopped defending him. People whispered in grocery stores and church pews. The man they thought they knew was looking more like a stranger with each passing day. Detective Monroe worked carefully to ensure every detail was airtight. She knew defense attorneys would attack every weak spot, so she reviewed everything multiple times. She consulted medical examiners, financial analysts, handwriting experts, and crime scene specialists. Every piece of the case had to line up. There could be no room for doubt. When the prosecutor announced that Harold Simmons would be charged with first-degree murder, the town of Elmswood held its breath. A trial was coming, and it would reveal everything, the secrets behind the staircase, the lies built into decades of marriage, and the greed that turned love into something deadly. The trial of Harold Simmons began on a gray Monday morning. Local news stations lined the courthouse steps, reporters holding microphones as curious residents gathered behind barricades. Everyone in Elmswood seemed to have an opinion about the case, but only 12 people would decide Harold's fate. Inside the courtroom, Harold sat at the defense table in a plain suit, expression unreadable. The prosecution was prepared, methodical, and confident. They knew their evidence wasn't flashy, but it was layered and deeply connected. The prosecution started by painting a picture of Harold's financial ruin. They displayed documents showing overdue credit cards, failed real estate ventures, and multiple requests for personal loans. His bank statements revealed a pattern: large transfers, quick withdrawals, and accounts that bled money every month. They argued that Harold saw Margaret not as a life partner, but as a way out. Her $1.9 million life insurance policy, updated only months before her death, was at the center of their argument. The jury learned that Harold had encouraged Margaret to increase the coverage and name him as the sole beneficiary. Not long after, she died under suspicious circumstances. Margaret's niece, Emily, took the stand next. She shared that Margaret had been planning to revise her will again to include her, and possibly, a local charity. Margaret had even asked for the name of a trusted lawyer in Florida to handle the changes discreetly. But before she could follow through, she was gone. Emily's voice cracked as she read an old birthday card from Margaret, a reminder of their bond. The courtroom was silent. The prosecution let it hang in the air before moving on. A medical examiner was called to explain the injuries found on Margaret's body. The examiner pointed to detailed photographs, showing bruising around the neck and chin. These, she said, were not caused by a fall. They were the result of pressure, deliberate, sustained, and likely done before the fall. The angle of the staircase. Injuries didn't match a natural tumble either. Margaret had no bruising on her hands or arms to indicate she tried to break her fall. Instead, the trauma was consistent with being unconscious or already dead when she struck the steps. The defense tried to counter, suggesting the bruises were a result of resuscitation efforts, or even a quirk of the body's response to injury. They argued that Margaret was elderly and fragile, and that falls can cause strange injury patterns. But it didn't help that Harold had admitted he didn't attempt CPR. His explanation for why was vague and inconsistent, making it harder for the jury to accept the accident theory. One of the key witnesses was the neighbor, Mrs. Green. She described seeing Harold in the backyard shed the night before the incident, carrying something bulky wrapped in cloth. She admitted she didn't know exactly what it was, but the timing and Harold's strange behavior stood out. Investigators later found gloves, duct tape, and a blood-stained necklace in that shed. The defense claimed the items had been there for months, that the blood could have been from an old injury, and that the necklace might have broken weeks earlier. But for the jury, it looked more like staging a sloppy attempt to clean up after a murder. Detective Monroe took the stand. With a calm and steady tone, she walked the jury through the investigation, step by step. She explained how Harold's version of events didn't match the forensic timeline, how the security system had been manually disabled, and how the phone and internet records revealed his late-night searches on staged accidents and life insurance claims. She never speculated. She stuck to the facts, and her confidence made an impact. Then came the discovery of Margaret's video diary. The jury watched as Margaret, sitting in her home office, quietly expressed concern about her husband's behavior. She never accused Harold directly, but her words were haunting. She spoke of feeling watched, of fearing something wasn't right, and of a gut feeling that she needed to make changes to her will as soon as possible. The date of that recording was just 4 days before she died. The defense tried to discredit the video, calling it speculative and emotional, but it was too powerful. Jurors saw a woman who seemed nervous, unsure, and alone just days before her life ended in what Harold had called a simple accident. One juror was seen wiping away tears. Another shook their head. The mood in the room shifted. Throughout the trial, Harold barely moved. He didn't react to testimony, avoided eye contact with witnesses, and never showed signs of remorse or grief. His legal team had advised him to remain composed, but to the jury, it looked cold. A man who had lost his wife of 4 decades should have felt something. But Harold looked more like a businessman in a meeting than a grieving husband at a murder. Trial. The prosecution ended with a timeline. It showed Harold's declining finances, his push for a new insurance policy, Margaret's growing suspicions, the forensic inconsistencies at the scene, and the digital evidence that tied him to research on how to fake accidents. The lawyer's voice grew louder as he painted the final moment, Harold waiting until Margaret was alone, disabling the alarm, confronting her, then making her death look like a fall down the stairs. He did it, the prosecution said, not out of rage or impulse, but calculation and greed. The defense closed by questioning the gaps. They said there were no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no confession. They warned the jury not to be swayed by emotion or speculation, and insisted that Harold loved his wife and would never harm her. They asked the jury to see a man wrongly accused, a man who had already lost everything, but the evidence was strong. The jury left the courtroom with grim expressions, carrying folders of notes and the weight of a town's expectations. Outside, the crowd had grown. Some held signs calling for justice for Margaret. Others whispered quietly, unsure what the outcome would be. It took the jury only 2 days to reach a decision. They had reviewed every photograph, every document, every witness statement. And when they returned, the courtroom fell silent. "Let me know when you're ready for Chapter 4. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back into their seats. Every movement, every sound, felt heavier than usual. Harold Simmons sat perfectly, still at the defense table, his hands folded in front of him, his face blank. The judge looked down from the bench and asked the foreperson if the jury had reached a verdict. The answer came quickly. They had. In the front row, Margaret's niece clutched a tissue, her eyes fixed on the foreperson. For a town that had spent months speculating, doubting, and whispering, this was the moment they had been waiting for. The foreperson stood, cleared her throat, and read the words that would change Harold's life forever. Guilty. Guilty of first-degree murder. The word echoed through the room. Harold didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He just sat there, as if the sentence had no meaning. For the prosecution, it was a hard-won victory. For Margaret's family, it was bittersweet. Nothing could bring her back, but at least now there was justice. The judge thanked the jury for their service and ordered Harold to be taken into custody until sentencing. Officers led him away in handcuffs, his footsteps muffled by the heavy carpet. Not once did he look back. The news hit Elmswood within minutes. Phones buzzed. TV anchors interrupted regular programming. For many, it was still difficult to accept that the man they knew as a polite, quiet neighbor had planned such a brutal act. But the evidence had spoken. The jury had spoken. Harold was now a convicted killer. In the weeks that followed, details about Harold's private life began to emerge. People who had once called him a friend now remembered odd moments, times when he had been overly possessive of Margaret, times when he had complained about money, hinted at frustration, or showed signs of bitterness toward her independence. Former co-workers mentioned a history of arrogance. One neighbor recalled hearing shouting late at night, arguments muffled through the walls. No one had thought much of it at the time. Now those memories felt like missed warning signs. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 4 weeks after the verdict. Margaret's family prepared victim impact statements. Her niece read hers aloud in court, describing how Margaret had been more than an aunt. She had been a mother figure, a mentor, a constant presence in her life. She described the pain of learning that someone she trusted, someone Margaret had loved, was the one responsible for her death. Other friends and community members submitted letters. They spoke of Margaret's kindness, her work with local charities, and how she had once helped pay for a stranger's medical bills without telling anyone. She had lived a quiet but generous life, and that made her murder all the more senseless. The judge listened carefully before delivering the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no reaction from Harold. He nodded slightly, as if he had already accepted what was coming. The judge said the crime had been cold, calculated, and fueled by greed. He described it as a betrayal of the deepest kind. To take a life for money, especially someone who had trusted and loved him, was something the court could not excuse. As the judge read the final words, Margaret's niece closed her eyes. It was over, but the story didn't end with the trial. Reporters began to dig deeper into Harold's past, looking for anything else he might have been hiding. One investigative journalist found a link to a previous marriage, one that had ended abruptly. Harold had been married once before, decades ago, to a woman named Elaine. She had died in a car accident in another state, and at the time, it had been ruled an unfortunate tragedy. But the circumstances were oddly familiar: a sudden death, a large insurance payout, no witnesses. The journalist passed the information to Detective Monroe. Curious, Monroe contacted authorities in the other state and requested the old case files. When they arrived, she pored over them carefully. The report noted that Elaine had died when her car veered off a bridge late at night. She had been alone. Harold had told police she was driving to visit her sister. The case had gone cold almost immediately. But now, with Harold's conviction for Margaret's murder, it was reopened. Though decades had passed, forensic experts examined the photos and the car's mechanical history. There was never proof of sabotage, but the possibility lingered. Monroe wasn't surprised. She had always sensed Harold's crime wasn't a moment of madness. It had been calculated, planned. If he had done it once, maybe he had done it before. The case of Elaine Simmons remained unsolved, but suspicions grew. Harold refused to speak to anyone about it. He declined interviews, ignored letters, and never responded to investigators. He remained silent in prison, keeping to himself in a small cell with gray walls and no view. Margaret's house was eventually sold. Her belongings were donated to charity, just as she would have wanted. The proceeds from her estate were redirected to her niece and the shelter she had supported for years. Her name was added to a memorial in the town square, a plaque that read, "In memory of a kind soul, taken too soon." The town of Elmswood slowly returned to its rhythm. The case had left a deep mark, reminding people that evil doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it sits quietly beside you at dinner, smiles politely, plans carefully. For Detective Monroe, the case was one of the most difficult she had worked. Not because of the forensics or legal challenges, but because of the betrayal at its core. She had seen crimes of passion, crimes of opportunity, but rarely one so drenched in calculation and selfishness. Margaret had deserved better. But at least in the end, the truth had come to light. Years passed after Harold Simmons was sentenced to life in prison, but the memory of the case still lingered in the quiet corners of Elmswood. It had become one of those stories people whispered about over dinner or referenced during neighborhood watch meetings. It wasn't just the crime that haunted them, it was how easily it had gone unnoticed until it was almost too late. People who once admired Harold's calm and polite manner now remembered the hollowness in his eyes, the coldness that, in hindsight, had always been there. Inside prison, Harold adapted quickly to life behind bars. He kept to himself rarely, spoke and followed every rule to the letter. He never expressed remorse. He never admitted guilt. To some of the prison staff, he was just another aging inmate blending into the system, slowly becoming part of the background. But one guard in particular noticed something unusual. Harold spent hours in the prison library, not reading novels or passing time idly, but studying legal documents, insurance policies, and criminal psychology books. He wasn't just serving time, he was researching. Meanwhile, Margaret's niece, Emily, did her best to move on. She used part of the inheritance left to her to open a small community center in Margaret's name. The center offered reading programs for children, job training workshops, and a small animal rescue facility. It quickly became a beloved place in town, a beacon of hope created from the ashes of tragedy. Emily often received visitors who came not just for help, but to share memories of Margaret. Through their stories, she continued to learn just how much her aunt had meant to the people around her. Despite the town healing on the surface, Detective Lisa Monroe couldn't fully let the case go. There was something about Harold's first wife, Elaine, that never stopped gnawing at her. The circumstances of Elaine's death were too convenient, too tidy. Monroe returned to the out-of-state jurisdiction and requested to revisit the scene where the car had gone off the bridge all those years ago. She stood there for hours, examining the layout, the condition of the guardrail, the incline of the road. She even met with a retired officer who had worked the scene. He admitted that, at the time, they didn't dig too deep. Harold had been cooperative, and Elaine's family hadn't raised many questions. Using updated forensic tools, the investigators reanalyzed the damage to the car and determined that it had veered sharply without any signs of braking. It appeared as though Elaine had either fallen asleep at the wheel or had been unconscious. Monroe obtained the autopsy report and had it reviewed by a modern medical examiner. The report noted minor bruising on Elaine's neck, dismissed at the time as a possible seatbelt injury. But now it raised red flags. There wasn't enough to prove Harold had killed his first wife, But there was enough to doubt the original conclusion. Monroe returned to Elmswood and placed the new findings in Margaret's case file. She made a note: possible serial offender, pattern of calculated spousal homicides, financial motive consistent. Although Harold would never be tried for Elaine's death, Monroe knew she had gotten close to the full truth. She sent a quiet message to Elaine's remaining family, explaining her findings and offering her condolences. For them it was closure. They never expected. Inside prison, Harold began filing motions, petitions, claims of wrongful conviction. He cited procedural errors, claimed the investigation had been biased, and insisted that the jury had been influenced by emotion rather than fact. Each time, the courts rejected his appeals. But he didn't stop. He continued studying, writing letters, looking for cracks in the system. It became his obsession. Then one day, Harold collapsed in the prison yard. Guards rushed to his side. The medical team confirmed he had suffered a severe stroke. He was taken to the prison hospital, unable to speak or move the right side of his body. He lingered there for months, growing thinner, more frail. Eventually, he was transferred to a long-term care unit inside the prison, where he remained bedridden and silent. News of Harold's stroke reached Elmswood quietly. There were no headlines, no public statements. For most people, he had already become a distant memory, a name in a file, a shadow that no longer loomed over their town. Emily visited Margaret's memorial at the community center the day she heard. She didn't celebrate. She didn't mourn. She just stood in front of her aunt's plaque, remembering the woman who had once read her bedtime stories and baked lemon cookies every Sunday. Detective Monroe retired 2 years later, but she never forgot the Simmons case. In her final report before handing off her files, she left one final note for future investigators. When greed replaces love, it creates monsters who wear human faces. Never underestimate what people are capable of when money is involved. The house where Margaret had lived was eventually bought by a young couple with a toddler. They remodeled it, added new railings to the staircase, painted the walls, and filled it with laughter. For them, it was just a charming old house. They didn't know its full history, and perhaps that was for the best. The community had moved forward,